It's really a great pleasure speaking with you today on a topic, that you, at least, I can say that you are an expert on. Um, but then before we start, I would like you to, tell the viewers your name.
Okay, so I'm Carmen McCain,
Okay.
and I'm a lecturer at SOAS, University of London, in African languages and literature.
Okay. So, how did you get interested in Nollywood movies, or specifically Kannywood?
Yeah, well, I came to Nollywood through
Through.
Kannywood,
Okay.
um, so I was actually planning to do my PhD on English language literature in
Okay.
Nigeria. I really love the novels of Halan Habila,
Okay.
and some of the newer Nigerian novelists. But
Okay.
I was in a PhD program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison
Okay.
in African languages and literature at the time. It's now African cultural studies,
Okay.
and one of the requirements was to be proficient in an African language.
Okay.
And I already spoke some Hausa. I grew
Okay.
up in Jos, and
Okay.
so I spoke some, but I wasn't fluent. So
Okay.
I was like, well, let me continue with Hausa because that will be easier.
Yeah.
I'll just finish up my requirement.
Yeah.
So I took Hausa at Wisconsin, and then I got a scholarship to go to Nigeria to continue to learn.
To
And I was
learn.
just
Okay.
thinking of it as getting rid of a requirement, and it was a ticket to Nigeria, so
Yeah.
I could continue my research
My
on
research. Okay.
Nigerian novels in English.
Okay.
But then my teacher Malami Buba, who was at that time at Usman Nampodio University, and I was staying in his house, so he would have study abroad students come and stay with him.
Okay.
So he had me start reading Hausa novels,
Hmm.
and there was a video club just down the street in
Okay.
Sokoto, and with Hausa movies. So I would go and I would rent those Hausa movies, and
Hmm.
just to help me with my speaking. And I just fell in love with it. The singing and dancing.
Oh
I
yeah.
loved the storylines were really compelling. And so also the literature. I was very interested in the literature.
Hmm.
So at the end of I think 2 months in
Okay.
Sokoto, he took me to Kano, and I met Ado Hamegiran Dabino, who's a best-selling novelist, but he's also a producer of films.
Films.
He's an actor in film. So he's a lot of people in Kano, especially at the beginning, were novelists, and
Yeah.
then they were also making
Making
films together,
films.
and
Yeah.
a lot of times adapting those novels from films. So I think the Hausa language film industry tended to be a little bit more tightly connected to literature, Hausa
Also
literature, than
literature
the English
and
language
English.
Nollywood. Which, I mean, now you have some adaptations. You
Yeah.
have the Elishan Oba
Election.
and the
Yes.
Half of Yellow Sun, but
Yeah.
those are more recent.
More recent. Okay.
So anyway, I when I was in Kano, I met a few people, and then I came back the next year in 2006
Hmm.
for I think 2 or 3 months,
Hmm.
just to get to know that better. And so I was going to Association of Nigerian Authors
Authors. Yes.
meetings, and I met with Balarabe Sango, who
Hmm.
was an author. He was a Hausa author,
Hmm.
but also a filmmaker. And so he took me to his office, and there I was, very starstruck. I saw Abbas Sadiq, who is actually an actor from Jos. I believe his father worked for NTA in Jos.
Okay.
But he'd made a film, Al Bashi, that I had seen in Sokoto,
So.
and I'd bought, and I'd written a paper on it. And
Oh my
so,
God.
and it
So
was
seeing
actually
him
my
was a big
first
deal.
my first academic publication came out of that paper on Al Bashi. So seeing him, I was, very starstruck, and he was, a movie star. And so I was very happy to meet him. And then
Hmm.
he was like, "Oh, I'm going to put you in a movie."
So
So
did he put you on a
he
movie?
did. So in that first in 2006, when I was first in Kano, it was really fun because there was so much going on,
Hmm.
and there was people shooting because Hausa films have singing and dancing in them.
Yeah.
So people were just singing and dancing on the. You just be going by the side of the road and you see
See
people
people.
shooting, singing and dancing. I guess it's a bit like TikTok now, where
Yeah.
like anybody can pick up a
Pick up.
camera. And so it was just so exciting, and there
Hmm.
seemed like there was so much creativity everywhere. All the world's a stage. We were on one set. There were 6 other films shooting in the same garden in
Hmm.
Kano. It was like a little garden space, and there were different
Wow.
films going on. So it was just really exciting. And so I was planning to focus on Hausa literature and film, and just kind of the excitement of the creativity. And then I had to go back to Wisconsin to finish up my prelim exams, and
Mhm.
just kind of get funding and get things into place to come back. So I wasn't able to come back in 2007, but I was able to get a small scholarship. I finished my prelims and came back in 2008. Unfortunately, in 2007, there had been a censorship crisis when, I don't know if you've heard of Mariam Hiana. She was an actress. I mean, she was with her boyfriend, and he took a phone video. So that was at the beginning of cameras having phones. It wasn't like
Mhm.
now where everyone videos everything.
Mhm.
And so he had taken a video of them having sex, and I think it stayed on his phone for like 2 years, and then he took his phone to get repaired, and it got out. And so then it started being forwarded around by Bluetooth at that time, and it was being called the first House of Blue film, like as if
Oh
it.
my
And so
God.
then
So it wasn't
Kannywood was. It
intentional.
wasn't intentional.
It's
It
not
wasn't, and it was a private thing,
private
but it was
thing.
being read as all of Kannywood. Like Kannywood was producing pornography,
Oh my God.
and so the censors board at that time, Shakarao was in power, so the censors board was harsher than it had been previously, and so they basically shut down filmmaking for I think 6 months or so,
Hmm.
um, and it became very difficult to make films in Kano at that time. There were still a lot of editing studios. You have to, because the Kano market is so powerful. It's an ancient market. It's like
Yeah.
800 years old. Those
Yeah.
Kano walls are 800 years or so.
Yeah.
So it's an old stop on the trans-Saharan trade route. So to move goods anywhere in the north or in Niger or anything, you have to sell in the Kano market, and that's why the Kano State Censors Board became so powerful,
Hmm.
because they
It's
they
an
could
inroad to
control
the
any.
market.
Because I
Yeah.
mean, people are making films in Jos, people are making things in Kaduna.
Yeah.
There's no reason that the Kano State Censorship Board should have become so powerful, except that the Kano market, the VCD market, had to go through Kano because of the Kano market. So because of that, it affected the censorship crisis affected the entire industry, because people couldn't sell their films in Kano unless they had passed them through
Pass
the
through
Kano
the
State Censors
concept.
Board.
Wow.
So what happened, and then in Kano themselves, they could make people register. They were saying they had to submit scripts and that sort of thing. And so people stopped making things in Kano as much, although there were, I can't tell you which films, but there are a few people who shoot inside rooms and stuff where
Underground kind of.
they wouldn't catch them. But most productions were going out of state, and then
Hmm.
they would come back, and their editors who were in Kano would work on the film, and they would release it
And the one is it.
in
Yeah.
Kano. So a lot of my research ended up, instead of hanging out on sets as much as I'd hoped to, although I went to some in Kaduna, Jigawa, Sokoto, and so on.
Hmm.
But I spent a whole lot of time in editing studios, just kind of hanging out with filmmakers. And my Halsa became better at that time because
Oh,
Baru
that's
and
why
Su,
you, you were
they
just
weren't they weren't
staring on the
yeah,
screen.
they didn't really need to talk to me in English. They were doing their work. So in order to understand what was going on and to like hang out with people, I had my Halsa just.
Oh my
So I always
gosh.
say it wasn't the university that taught me Halsa. It was Halsa filmmakers who taught me Halsa. So that's just kind of a brief summary
A
of,
brief
not
summary
not so brief, but that's kind of how I got into
into
Kannywood
Kannywood.
research. So it
Yeah.
came through English language literature to Hausa literature
Literature and
to Hausa
house of
film, which was
films.
kind of interacting with Hausa literature.
Yeah. So
So.
apart from the initial challenges that had to do with the censorship
Mhm.
crisis and um, did you have, again, as someone who had lived in America, of course you lived in Jos,
Mhm.
and then but going back and forth, was there uh, any kind of cultural shock? I mean, in terms of the story
Yeah.
and themes and
hmm
storylines.
One thing. So being in Jos,
Yeah.
there's a lot of what people say about the North, especially because Sharia had just been implemented
Hmm.
a few years previously, and
Hmm.
so the idea that you have in Jos, before I went to Sokoto for
Yeah.
language learning, it's like everybody's going to be in
In
strict
Porter.
hijab.
Yeah.
You can't ride on the back of a motorcycle or anything. And
Yeah.
the first thing I saw when I got into Sokoto was a girl in a spaghetti strap tank top on the back of a motorcycle. I'm like, okay, people's impressions of the core North are not quite
True.
correct. And
Yeah.
so I found that to largely, there are the signs with Quranic verses on them. And in Kano, there was Adede Tesahu, it was kind of the propaganda wing. So there's the Hizbah, which are
Yeah.
like the police. And then there's Adede Tesahu, it's not there anymore, but in the time of Shakarao, it was like a societal reorientation directorate. So kind of a propaganda wing. They actually hired Hausa novelists to write these didactic novels. So you had the censors board, which is kind of in the Hizbah, which are kind of the stick, and the Societal Reorientation Directorate, which is the which is the carrot. And so in Kano, it's, people are just normal people. They live
People.
normal lives, but
Yeah.
you have to kind of live in such a way as to not make waves. And so I think, sometimes men can be a little bit misogynistic. That would
Yeah.
rub me the wrong way.
Yeah.
And obviously things are very different. I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
Most of the people I spent time with were Muslims. I did go to the Equa Church there, so I knew some women. I had a Bible study group in the Equa Church, so I would see Christians on Sunday. But other than that, I was living in an entirely Muslim environment as an American,
Yeah.
white American Christian.
Yeah.
So so I learned a lot, I think, and there were some things that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and things I probably did. I lived a lot more free of a life than as a Hausa woman I
Yeah.
would have. But I also have always tried to fit in as well as I can. So I always wear Nigerian clothes. I would always put on a mayafi, and
Yeah.
then I started learning how to tie head ties. So normally I would, if I were in Kano, I would have a head tie on, and I wouldn't be wearing this because it's too short. So I would be wearing a longer dress with a mayafi and head tie. So, I'm sure I made all sorts of cultural mistakes, and people tend to be forgiving of me because I'm a foreigner. But I tried to fit in as much as
As
possible
much as
and speak
possible.
Hausa as much as possible.
Yeah,
So,
I wanted to say, so the effect of so
mhm.
a great improvement in your Hausa knowledge
When I am in Kano, it
when you
gets
went
much better, or when
better.
I'm speaking it a lot. Right now, it's a little bit rusty because I don't use it as
Easy,
often.
easy.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I mean, again, so what is the striking difference between the film? I mean, the films shot in Kano, I
Mm.
mean, in the north, and then I mean, you've been exposed to both the Nollywood
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Hollywood. I mean, and Kannywood.
Hmm.
So what do you think is so special? I mean, the striking difference between both.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Nollywood has all these different genres, and
Yeah,
Yoruba films would be slightly different from English
from
language films and
English.
Igbo films and so
Yeah.
on. But I think Kannywood has been very much influenced by Indian films. Indian films are
Hmm.
very popular. Brian Larkin has written about this,
Yeah.
right, in Abdallah Uba Adamu. But Indian films are extremely popular. And so it's kind of a toss up if you go into House of Home whether you'll see people watching Bollywood films or Kannywood films.
Mm.
And so Kannywood films are structured like Indian films. So
Mm.
up until recently,
Mm.
right? Because with the death of the VCD, it's kind of changed how people have been able to operate. But usually, at least until recently, most Hausa films that you see will have at least 2 or 3 or 4 singing and dancing
Hmm.
sequences like Indian films. And I think, that's one of the most criticized things. The cultural critics in Kana really hate those singing and dancing sequences. The censors board has tried to, you know, do something about them, but the films at that time would not sell without them.
Without them, yeah.
So they have to be careful. They can't touch. So no one in a house of film can touch, even if you're acting somebody's husband and the wife is going into labor or something. The husband can't pick her up. He has to be like, oh. So in the singing and dancing, they would have to be far apart. But I think that singing and dancing, although by critics say it's just copying Indian films, it does a lot of work in the storyline too. So
Mm.
not all of them, right? In every industry, there are films that don't make any sense, but
Yeah.
the best films, the songs and dances become a kind of commentary on the story,
Hmm.
or it can kind of expand the story, or it can reveal it. Like I wrote a paper on Zazabi, a film about HIV, and so we know that it's a love triangle. We know that one lover has HIV at the beginning. We don't know that one has it until the end. But the song and dance,
Mm.
it wouldn't spoil the story if you don't know. But if you go back and listen to it, you can see the actual it encapsulates what happens in the story in the song and dance. So I think that those songs and dances are a lot more than just spectacle. They've
Yeah.
sometimes been written about as showstoppers or spectacles, but they kind of encapsulate the story, or they act like a kind of poem in the middle of the story that comments on or expands on what's happening in the story. So
So I
yeah.
mean, do they perform the same function as you would say of the chorus in Greek theater,
In some
or the
ways,
opera?
I mean,
So which one?
yeah, I mean, they do their own thing, right? But yes, they kind of in some ways play. They can. I mean, also the soundtrack does this in Nollywood too, right? Where
Hmm.
you have
Yeah,
people commenting on the
commenting.
story
Yeah,
and the song, and
yeah.
you have that happen in Kannywood soundtracks as well.
Oh,
And the songs and dances can do that as well. I mean, the songs and dances will do different things, so
different
it
things.
depends on which film you see,
Yeah,
how you analyze what's
yeah.
happening in
So
the singing.
basically, they are integral part of the story.
It not always, right? And so
Without them,
the
would the story
sometimes,
still
I
make a
mean,
lot of sense?
sometimes. So it
Hmm.
depends, right? The ones that are really slapped together, sometimes it will just be a popular sounding song, and it doesn't have too much to do with the story. But in the best ones,
Yeah.
and I usually, if I'm going to talk about the
Hmm.
output of an industry, I
Yeah.
don't want to just focus on the nonsense, which
No.
every
Oh,
industry
sure,
focuses on, but on the
sure.
best ones. And so I
Yeah.
would say the best ones generally, yeah, the without the song and dance, it's bereft of something.
Hmm.
Although in the best ones, also the storyline will make sense.
Hmm.
But yeah.
So in the subject matter, I'm really interested in the subject matter in terms of um, the concerns about Nollywood is, I mean, Kannywood, um, is a lot more. Again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Mhm.
Um, it's kind of conservative. The topics
Mhm.
treated.
Yeah.
So then, how do you think, in terms of gender relations, in terms of women,
Yeah.
are the stories fair to women?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about House of Films, I
Yeah,
think even more, although Nollywood has done this too.
yeah,
There's a lot of criticism of Nollywood that
yeah,
they're teaching people how to behave badly and so on. And
yeah,
that's the same thing you see in Kano, but it's just a lot more intense
yeah,
in Kannywood because you have the censors board, you have the Hizba, and
yeah.
so on. So, um, a lot of times, especially after the implementation of Sharia, people will try to show in the films that they'll try to teach people how to be good Muslims
Yeah,
and or make sure that there's some sort of lesson at the end.
yeah,
So that can affect the storylines, um, but and sometimes, yeah, I mean it's showing women how they should live, how to learn how to live with a co-wife or something,
hmm,
and that happens in novels too. But
yeah,
a lot of times it also shows like intense, family drama that
hmm,
happens when you have multiple wives, and
yeah.
then their children are vying for um, dominance and so
Dominance.
on. So there's a whole lot of wahala in Kannywood film. It shows a whole lot of family drama a lot of times,
Hmm.
and what I argue in my book that I'm working on, and that I wrote about in my PhD dissertation, is kind of the politics of exposure in
Hmm.
Kannywood, and that drives a lot of conflict with the critics as well,
Yeah,
because sometimes they will show things that are happening, men abusing women and so on
yeah,
that are happening, but that's supposed to stay behind closed doors. You don't bring that out into the open. You don't expose, you don't wash your dirty laundry in public.
in
And so
public. Yeah,
sometimes those films will kind of expose some of those things, and so then
yeah,
that contributes to some of the criticism that they're you know doing. I mean, some of them too are just about young people falling in love, and then so a common theme would be forced marriage, or someone falls
hmm,
in love, they're not allowed to marry their boyfriend because their family wants them to marry someone else. And so there's a lot of that sort of thing in the novels and the films as well. And so the criticism of that is that you're teaching, uh, that the films are contributing the high divorce rate in society,
yeah,
because you're idealizing young love, and your parents actually do know better who you should marry. And so you're now
hmm.
teaching young girls that they should just go pick some
Pick someone.
some
Yeah,
guy like Adam Zango with
yeah,
sunglasses who's acting cool, who's not going to end up being a good husband. But the films explore those things too, right? Some cool guy comes and marries some girl, and then he ends up being a terrible husband. So I would
yeah.
say that the stories don't just do one thing. They're doing lots of different
So in
things.
other words, I mean, the Kannywood is probably more radical than people acknowledge, or
Yeah, I
more than
mean,
people give them
yeah,
credit
yeah.
for.
I would say so. I think there's a lot of kind of political content
Content.
and kind of, I mean, kind of. a domestic so the one I teach, it's a more recent one. I think it's 2018. Maria Ali Nuhu directed it, and Fauzia Di Sulaiman, who also writes for I think is it Kwana Chasa in one of the Erewa 24 serials. But she's kind of a really staunch. I don't know if I'd call her feminist, but very concerned about what happens to young girls and abuse of women and so on. And so in this film, Maria, it shows this young girl. She wants to be a doctor, and she has a young boyfriend who's very much in support of her. So it's kind of the ideal couple who will grow up and be, a benefit to society.
Yeah.
Because she's ambitious, he's very much in support, and yet there's this old man who tends to do the saki, what aure saki aure. He will marry lots of people and then divorce them as soon as he's tired of them. So he sees her, he decides he wants her, and so then he tries to get her. And her mother, she's orphaned. Her mother is a widow. And so he comes to the mother, and she's like, of course not. No, she's going to get educated, and so on. So she won't allow that, but she's a widow, and so normally the father would make that decision. Yeah. So then they go to the brother of the husband, the uncle, and then they give him a bribe, and so he marries her off to this disgusting old man, right, with all these grown children. In fact, his own son is after her, and he's like a thug. He's a scoundrel, right? He's also after her, but then his father ends up marrying her by force, and so her mother is upset. She's upset. Her boyfriend is upset, but nobody can do anything because he's like a powerful person in the town. And so the story ends up being kind of exploring newspaper headlines, right? So she is being accused of poisoning her husband, and so then we see a woman who's a lawyer. So she's kind of like the ideal of what this girl and her boyfriend could have been. Her husband is a policeman, I think. She's a lawyer, and so she ends up taking the case. And then Ali Nuhu plays her husband, and she's busy at the office. She comes home and he's cooked her dinner, right? So it's this kind of maybe not very realistic, but kind of aspirational, and in terms of what the writer is trying to say, what would be ideal for an ideal couple, right? To have one man, one woman who are supportive of each other in their careers, and then that would be good. So we see kind of the thwarted aspirations in the young couple, and then what they could have become in the older couple. So I think it was popular, and my students loved it. I talked about this yesterday. There were Somali and Tanzanian students in the class, and they were really intrigued by it, and it said, "Oh, this is very similar to something
with them,
that would happen in our own society." So that's when I started thinking, if Kannywood could start, subtitling or even dubbing, because the dubbing seems to be more popular with popular audiences, into Swahili, into Somali, then they could have a much wider Pan-African, or even Wolof and Bambara, in West Africa. So there's so many intermarriages between Hausa people and Fulfulde people that are Fulani people that there are a lot of storylines that are about Fulani. There are a lot of storylines that include people. They tend to be in Hausa because Hausa is, Hausa has become like English. It's dominant in the region.
It's like the lingua franca.
But there are so many, like Fulani, there are so many stories about Fulani. In fact, a lot of the writers and actors, a lot of the actors are Fulani, or at least their mother was Fulani or something. So there are a whole lot of storylines that include Fulani culture. Yeah.